Hello everybody, I hope you're doing well. I am currently attending a communication convention in Dallas, Texas. However, I will be able to get to your emails as soon as I can when I receive them from you. Also, I will have your argumentative essays graded with feedback from me by Thanksgiving at the latest, so look out for those. Remember that we are really down to the wire in the class, so we just have a few more weekly activities and quizzes, and then we have both the final exam as well as the refutation block. Remember that for the refutation block, you are specifically refuting and arguing against your own claims that you make in the argumentative essay. So you're not responding to counterclaims or arguments that somebody would make against your case. Rather, you are the one that's making arguments against your own position. And you can do that in a variety of different ways. Again, I'm really happy to look over any sort of rough drafts or outlines that you might have. So the last few chapters are kind of sorted together because they're pretty short and they draw from existing material that we've talked about. So chapters 12, 13, and 14 talk about argumentation in different contexts, including law, science, and religion. And so they really build on everything that we've talked about thus far, but have some specific technical and public spheres in which they operate. So there are a few new terms and concepts, as well as applications of previous concepts here. So argumentation in law. One of the things that Aristotle really kind of plots out is that there is forensics rhetoric. So forensic rhetoric is an investigation of the past and the use of evidence, right? There's epididactic rhetoric, which is sort of like celebratory or focused on the present. And then there's deliberative rhetoric, which focuses a lot on the future. However, argumentation in law is about forensic evidence, right? It's a form of forensic rhetoric because it investigates what happened, right? So if there was a murder, right, what evidence is there to indicate that that happened? If there was some sort of economic injustice, where was the evidence that indicated that that happened, right? So the Lilly Ledbetter case is used as an example of that. And is one that the chapter really kind of walks through. And in this case, you see the importance of telling a narrative or cohesive story, because in this case, Lilly Ledbetter suggested that she experienced pay discrimination. So the narrative that she conveyed was incredibly important for constructing the case and building together facts. You also see that there is a burden of proof. So when the plaintiff, the person that's putting out the case and arguing the case, is getting that out there, they have to demonstrate that there was some sort of injustice or harm or violation of the Constitution or of existing laws that indicate a need for that case to be tried. So there has to be that burden of proof. Additionally, this chapter talks about the idea of preponderance of evidence. So preponderance of evidence exists beyond a reasonable doubt, which is a legal term that's used to designate when something is proven. So beyond a reasonable doubt, if pay discrimination existed, then therefore the case holds true. Similarly, we talked a lot about the prima facie case earlier, so setting up all of the necessary elements of the case for burden of proof, including the harms, as well as various claims and support that help develop the case. And you see that in the example of the Ledbetter narrative. You also see that in terms of a lot of other cases. So for instance, Obergefell v. Hodges stated that states had to legally recognize marriage licenses for same-sex couples. Similarly, the case of Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission decided that essentially super PACs and corporations could have a larger share in donations than they ordinarily could do in the past. So there's a variety of different narratives and stories that come together in order to support cases on either side. If any of you are familiar with the O.J. Simpson trial, that is another very good example of the ways that narratives are used in legal argumentation because, for instance, individuals such as Cochran, right, put out very compelling narrative cases surrounding things such as racial injustice that were going on in that case as well. So there's a variety of different narratives that are presented. Another important concept too is the idea of commonplaces, right? So commonly held beliefs. So we can assume that if somebody was at this spot at this time of day, then they were probably getting a cup of coffee or something to drink, right? So that's something that might be used as a commonplace. Additionally, right, deciding only to dispose, that means that a case can be decided on a simple issue. So yes, this particular part of the Constitution was violated, therefore that case goes in this direction, right? Additionally, claims have to come through in a timely manner. So if you've ever heard of statute of limitations, right, that's the idea that if some sort of injustice has happened for X period of time, then it can no longer be tried. So there's a variety of things that are talked about here. In addition, we have the idea of an analogy, so making analogous arguments. So for instance, using precedent or information from a past case to inform a current case. So if somebody made that decision in the past, that would affect how they evaluated a similar case. And that's something that Supreme Court justices use a lot. Additionally, there's stare decisis. So that's the idea of precedents, right? So prior cases need to be respected. So if somebody ruled, for instance, that free speech was acceptable in this instance, then the same court would need to rule that case again in a current case, unless they decided to particularly overturn an existing decision. And that happens sometimes. So you also see the use of logic, including major premise, minor premise, and conclusion, happen in legal argumentation a lot. So for instance, so-and-so was on the phone during the time of the murder. If somebody is on the phone, then they couldn't have done the murder. Therefore, that person is not a murderer, right? So that's the example of the syllogism in that instance. Additionally, you find maybe some policy-oriented arguments. So suggesting some type of policy action is pretty common. So we also see, for instance, reductio ad absurdum, so the idea that we blow up an argument to make it sound absurd. So you hear this a lot, oh, well, if we rule in this way, then, what's to stop this next thing from happening, right? So slippery slope types of arguments are commonly used in these contexts. Additionally, so those are some of the major concepts that are talked about in legal argumentation. I think the big thing to know is a few of those concepts, as well as how kind of narratives play out and are talked about, as well as fundamental elements in logic and argumentation more broadly. Additionally, right, so not only authority, but the only other concept is the idea of lache, which is a commonplace that, according to the book, equity aids the vigilant and not those who procrastinate regarding their rights. So that means that, if you intentionally sandbag and wait a long time until you file a case, then you are doing that in a way that is actually against the justice that you're trying to put forward. So if you wait to put forward a case until it's strategically advantageous for you to do so, that's something that, in that instance, would be criticized. So now let's talk about argumentation in science. And this is a technical sphere, oftentimes, that has been talked about a lot. So science, right, is based in a lot of different ways, but it has a particular method. So in science, you start with this sort of broad idea or hypothesis. You conduct some sort of experiment or study. You go out and you observe and collect data. Then you reach some sort of conclusion, and then that goes back and affects the overall knowledge that you have. And that process, right, has happened for a very long period of time. So for instance, as a kid, I did a science experiment involving rolling marbles down a ramp. So what I would do is I would wonder, okay, I don't know how marbles would behave if they go down this ramp. So I conducted an experiment in which I rolled down marbles and I timed it. And I collected that data, and from that data, I could figure out, how things like gravity and rate of speed and all of that worked in the context of marbles. That's an example of using that scientific method. And so, right, so the scientific method is based off of what we observe and collect in terms of data. So even though at times it can seem very neutral and objective, there are a lot of elements of experimentation that are very much human, right? So part of how science is persuasive is the idea that it's seen as rational and objective, right? You start with that hypothesis or that idea that you're trying to test and you put that out there, right? And then it says, for instance, that there is the natural order. There is the way of things as they currently exist. There's claims of fact that happen a lot in terms of science. So, for instance, the Earth is round, or gravity exists, right? So these are things that are commonly debated a lot. So the way the argumentation works is it uses those arguments of fact, and it uses a lot of support and warrants that demonstrate why those particular arguments are correct. We also see that, for instance, scientific argumentation is very concerned with figuring out what types of arguments are true. It advances facts and information about the world for the sake of information. So rather than being an intrinsic or instrumental value, it is instead a terminal value, knowledge for knowledge's sake. You see, for instance, peer review. So other scientists go through each other's research and determine if it's worth publication and is worthy of evidence. It's empirical results, right? So empiricism is the idea that we build off of the past and past studies. We also see that the deductive method, right? So we gain new research and new information based on past research. So if you, as you did the annotated bibliography, right, to set up your argument, you built off of past information. Similarly, if you've ever worked on a literature review, you have to use previous studies to explain where your study fits in, right? We stand on the shoulders of giants, and scientific research is very interested in advancing from previous study. Generalization is also really important because scientific argumentation tries to get generalizable and kind of replicable results. So if we found that this plant was able to grow in this sunlight, then maybe other plants could do that too. It expands on the usefulness of the knowledge that's provided. Additionally, there's retroduction, right? So it basically develops a hypothesis that explains the results that you found. So we can determine that things like friction helped explain why the marble rolled down the way it did. That's an example of generalizability being used a lot in argumentation in science. We also see that there's a lot about causes, so we try to figure out in scientific argumentation what causes something else. So for instance, a conditional cause is using something like statistical probability in order to determine if something causes something else. So we can determine that it is likely that the friction of the ramp affected the rate at which the marble rolled down it, right? So that would be an example of using conditional cause. There's also, for instance, things like argumentation by signs. So when I was in high school, I had to memorize a lot of different formulas and use those types of signs in order to conduct scientific study, as well as other argument types, including argumentation from analogy, argumentation from authority. So a lot of celebrities or authority figures in science are people that are drawn on a lot. Specific instances, right? So using a particular study, maybe like a plant, to make more generalizable statements about how plants grow is an example of that in action. As well as testimony, so individual accounts of how certain things work. So scientific argumentation very much operates as making many types of claims of fact and grounding those in examples of observation. Finally, we have argumentation in religion. And that's another, at times, very technical sphere of argumentation in which a variety of different types of patterns emerge. So there are a lot of questions about the use of evidence and support, as well as narratives that emerge in science and religion. So revealed theology, for example, comes in the idea that you examine particular texts that reveal empirical or correct data. So for instance, if a sacred text such as the Quran, the Bible, Torah, etc. suggests that, for instance, like origin of human life, right, then that is used as the basis for making various claims. And then you have natural theology, which suggests that God exists from nature, or some sort of deity, or some sort of explanation for why life is the way it is. So from nature, or from like our observations, we can determine that there's some sort of higher power, is the argument that somebody would make in natural theology. Additionally, right, determining things like human nature, why do humans behave the way they do, how is there some sort of religious explanation for that, what is the right thing to do, so ethics, morals, a lot of value claims are important. Things like sin or making morally incorrect decisions, right, that's something that plays into. Additionally, right, there's the concept of salvation. So the benefit that somebody receives from belief is something that gets talked about a lot. You have, obviously, like churches or other forms of religious organization that are used to kind of put these things together. And then you have the use of sacred documents. So, for instance, actual texts that suggest a justification for religious argumentation. So there are a lot of different types of institutions and spheres in which religious argumentation is happening. And there's also a lot of questions about how those are interpreted. So a lot of times, for instance, different preachers or pastors take different approaches to interpreting that type of information, as well as various disputes about what types of information is trustworthy or true. And so tradition, right, what has been done in the past is oftentimes invoked as a form of evidence. So the way, for instance, that churches organize themselves might be based on something like that. The use of personal experience. So if somebody says, for instance, that they had a revelation or some sort of moment where they had some sort of religious awakening, that's oftentimes used. So that revelation, right, it aids in kind of understanding some sort of text. Culture, right? So the audience, the context, the variety of people that come together to form meaning is oftentimes invoked as well. So when you're thinking about how these types of arguments emerge, right? Argument from authority is a really common way that religious argumentation occurs. Analogy, so comparing, for instance, a fable or a biblical story. So the story, for instance, of Cain and Abel is oftentimes invoked a lot. Narrative argumentation, including the use of a variety of different stories, is invoked a lot, as well as argumentation by sign. One concept that's a little bit trickier is argument by paradox. So it suggests that, for instance, things that there are a variety of different views that might contradict themselves related to a single phenomena. So there are, for instance, different stories of creation. So there's a variety of different interpretations, and the paradox suggests that these multiple interpretations kind of vary and are still potentially correct or valuable in different ways. So argument by generalization is used as well. So from these specific texts, we can reach more broader interpretations. So in conclusion, these three chapters introduce a lot of kind of new terms, particularly in legal argumentation. But as you can see, most of it is an application of things that we've talked about all semester to particular specific contexts. So as you're preparing for the activity and the quiz for this week, be thinking about the ways that you can take some of these specific spheres and know a couple of the key terms, but be able to apply them in terms of understanding how argumentation is functioning and works. That being said, I hope you all have an excellent rest of your week, and feel free to get in touch with me if you have any questions.